Hi everyone, I hope you're well. So today I want to talk about this channel that I have mentioned before, and I really like his stuff, Finn McKenty or the Punk Rock NBA. I like his channel. I think I've learned a lot from him, and he's made me think about things that I hadn't really considered before or that I hadn't seen that way before. I think he's got a lot to bring to a discussion because he's been listening to a lot of different kinds of punk and rock and metal for a long time. That being said, I found a few things here and there that I have disagreed with, or that I have noticed that metalheads in general tend to disagree with him on, and I want to touch on those things. But I also want to mention some things that I have appreciated or that I have learned from him, just for the sake of not making an entirely, shit-talking video, just dedicating an entire video about talking shit about his channel. So the first thing that you might expect pretty much any metalhead to mention in terms of the things he's talked about his channel is that video on black metal. And I want to get it out of the way because it's probably his most disliked video among his most popular ones, or maybe his most disliked video in general. I'm not sure, but it seems to be. Now, to be fair, I think a lot of people in the comments are kind of overreacting just to the title itself. It's not wrong to ask oneself or someone else, hey, why do people like this kind of music? Like, what is so appealing and interesting about this type of music? We don't all like all kinds of music, really. So I don't think it's necessarily a judgmental question. It could very well just be a question asked out of curiosity. But the problem here is that I think that he doesn't really answer the question in the title. He doesn't really give much thought or much of a hypothesis on why people really love black metal that much. It's mostly like reasons why he doesn't like it, and he explains most of the appeal of it on the image and the shock value and the sort of lore and history in it. But I think he doesn't quite commit to saying that explicitly either. But most of the video is just about how black metal was doing something different from what metal was doing at that moment, and that got a lot of attention, and therefore it got very, popular by underground standards, I guess. And his constant critique is really that most black metal sounds the same, or that it's gonna stale and boring, that it takes itself too seriously while being also kind of corny and ridiculous, and that it pretends to be more rebellious and anti-establishment than it really is. And interestingly, he actually admits a couple of times that that's actually the same thing for a lot of different types of music that aren't even necessarily metal, like he says, what does he call it, traditional punk or something like that. But for some reason it bothers him more coming from black metal because of a bunch of reasons that also apply to other genres, that aren't even exclusive to black metal either. And at some point, I think he does make somewhat of a valid point. He brings up this quote by Euronymous or someone, I don't know, but they were saying something that essentially equated to them trying to dictate a dress code to the subgenre, and how that sort of ironically is also pretty conformist. But I think you could say that about pretty much all kinds of alternative subcultures, goths, metalheads, punks, you name it, they're all pretty much always expected to dress and look a certain way, and there's a specific way where you are expected to not look, especially if it's too, conformist or what have you. And I'm not even that big of a fan of black metal myself, but it's kind of interesting that after saying that it was stale and all of that, he actually admits that a lot of black metal is different and experimental. And those are sort of the exceptions to him. He doesn't quite see those as really counting as black metal, apparently. But I feel like there's quite a lot of those bands that sound different, and really even within the sub-genres, they all sound very different from each other, depressive, suicidal, and, the industrial black metal, they sound very different from each other, for example, or, the more experimental types like Psy, it sounds very different from the, second wave Norwegian black metal, and there's a lot of variety in terms of the topics, the moods, and all these things. So I don't know why he's trying to convince himself. It's like he's trying to convince himself the whole time that he really does have a very specific reason why he doesn't like it. I think he just kind of doesn't like it, but he's like really trying to look for a reason, and he's like, well, it's okay if you don't like it, but another thing is to make this video under the guise of being informative, when I feel like that video is really more of a rehashing of the video about death metal and what killed death metal. Yeah, the topics are a little bit clickbaity, but that's kind of the least of my problems with the videos, as you can see. I think that it goes on the same kind of things, you know, like black metal was kind of reacting to what was the norm in death metal at the time and all these kinds of things, but at the same time the black metal video doesn't really go any further than that. And I think maybe a lot of his dislike towards black metal, he hints at it himself, is the fact that a lot of the beliefs and, you know, behind the image and the attitude of black metal were very anti-death metal, you know, at least in the kind of beginning or in the Norwegian era. And this idea that these other bands were fake because they dressed too normally and all these things, and the sound was too polished and it was too technical. But the thing is that he takes this one quote from one guy that a lot of, you know, black metal listeners don't even necessarily tend to take him seriously or anything or care what he has to say. And he takes that one quote and uses it to explain the entire ideology behind the whole subgenre, you know, as if it represented all musicians in the whole of black metal. Speaking of that, it seems that a lot of people in the comments also took offense to him saying that black metal was really good at marketing or something like that, but probably because, you know, I think for a lot of metalheads that kind of makes it sound like it's less genuine, which is precisely what you won't want to hear, I guess. But I don't think that was really meant as much of an insult, because to him marketing is something very important. So I would say that for him that was more of a pro than really anything else. And I don't think he's even implying that that these musicians were even doing anything shocking for the sake of having attention in the media or anything like that. I think that it was kind of accidental that black metal got so much attention, and it wasn't just the image and the lore crafted to get eyes on them, which I think maybe a lot of people thought that that was maybe what he was implying, that it was all just gimmick. But I think it would have been interesting for him to kind of delve into why people like the music itself. In fact, that was really what I was expecting the video to be about. I would like to have someone explain like what exactly makes that music itself so appealing and interesting, especially for people who weren't necessarily very conscious, you know, alive during the whole overlap of death metal and black metal, like back in the 90s, or maybe they were little kids, or they hadn't even been born back then. So the video really ends up repeating a lot of points and leaves a lot of questions still unanswered. Another pretty controversial video by him is the Poppy and Baby Metal one. I don't think it was nearly as disliked as the black metal video, but it was still a pretty bad ratio of likes to dislikes. The main problem that people saw in that video is a very specific moment or a couple of moments where he claims that Baby Metal lip sync when they perform live, and a lot of people, pretty much all the top comments, were telling him that they didn't, that they hadn't lip synced for a while, and especially the main the main singer doesn't lip sync live at all. And a lot of people are explaining that their shows are actually very interesting, and the way that they perform live is just kind of a breath of fresh air among other metal bands. And he basically just took one of their most popular songs from their first studio album to use as like the one example of what their music sounds like. And it wasn't very fair because that video is from last year, so he could have just taken a couple of songs and, you know, gotten a better idea of what they sound like. So it really makes it seem like he just didn't research enough to make a video about it, to make a full video talking about that band. And he did make another video, actually. That's kind of I think the main problem that people have with this initial video. He has a second video where he mentions how baby metal fans are one of the worst fandoms in metal and rock, and the main reason that he gives is the response to that video. Definitely there was a very negative response to that video, not just the comments but also some video responses that you can see, you can look up. Like I said, the top comments, I think they were a little bit critical, but definitely not mean, you know. I definitely had to look really hard to find any like outright mean comments in that video, but I guess that maybe he could be talking about like really mean tweets or, you know, things that people DM'd him or something like that. So in his other channel, which is just called Finn McKenty, there's this one video where he's responding to like hater videos, and there's one response to that video where he says something like, the guy responding is saying something like, oh well, what did you expect, you know, you're talking shit about a band, why wouldn't you expect hateful comments after you do that? And Finn McKenty basically says, well, that's not a very good argument, because he's just he's not really able to justify it, and also because just expecting it doesn't really make it okay, you know, the fact that why should I expect something that isn't right in the first place? And I do agree it's not a very good argument, and I feel like that video, from what I saw of it, it was basically just that guy making the same argument over and over. And I think that, you know, him saying uninformed things about Baby Metal is not a good excuse to starting collectively dogpile and insult him, but I also think he was a little bit too quick to call him one of the worst fandoms in metal, because again, most of what I was able to see, the criticism was very level-headed and honestly not hateful at all. Like I said, I scrolled down for a while in that video and I wasn't really able to find many comments, and the ones that were there were kind of like really hidden among replies to other comments and stuff like that. So I feel like maybe even the fandom itself was making sure to not put too much of a spotlight on the really bad comments that shouldn't have been made in the first place. It's like, I think that they actually were pretty good about it for the most part, from what I'm able to see, you know, among the most liked comments in that video. To be clear, you know, there's no justification for hateful comments or insults on a video that's just like at worst uninformed and biased against the band, even if it's something to be expected. However, I don't want you to keep that to be expected argument in mind, because that's a tool that's gonna be important later. Another thing that I wanted to touch on from that one initial video about Poppy and Baby Metal is a few comments that he makes that I think might have also contributed to the criticism and to the dislikes of that video. And I'm referring to a couple moments where he says that image and gimmicks are probably even more important to metalheads than they are, you know, in metal as they are to genres like pop. And I saw some comments questioning that line as well, but I wanted to make my own take on it as well. For the most part, I actually think he's right about metalheads placing a lot of importance on image, but I don't really think it's the way that he makes it seem in that video. I almost see it as the opposite of what he's saying, because he says the numbers show that metalheads have a strong preference for those gimmicky bands or the very image-based or image-driven bands. But I don't think he really considers that a lot of the listeners are probably not necessarily people who tend to listen to metal or consider themselves to be metalheads in the first place. And here I'm not talking about posers, I'm talking about people who maybe wouldn't necessarily consider themselves metalheads at all, or they just don't really care for metal for the most part, you know, in the first place. And maybe the only bands that they listen to are bands like Baby Metal or Poppy or Ghost, you know, those are the exceptions. A lot of people might be like that, so the numbers of listeners to those bands on Spotify or what have you, they don't necessarily reflect how much metalheads specifically tend to like those bands. Of course, I don't really have the statistics to prove that most Poppy listeners are non-metal listeners, or the same about Ghost or, you know, Baby Metal or whatever, but neither does he, from what I could tell in that video. It seems that he only assumed that based on the numbers themselves, without really considering any other possibility at all. But like I mentioned, I do think he was right in saying that metalheads care more about image than they might care to admit. But the way I see it, it's more like the image that they want to portray and that they want band members to portray is that they don't care about image itself or looking good. I think there's somewhat of a dislike towards that really polished or manufactured look, you know, anything too deliberate. In fact, now thinking back, I think a lot of metalheads who now like Baby Metal initially were pretty skeptical of the sort of cutesy image, because I guess there was a lot of assumption that the band is all image, so now they don't have to try to make good music. So the music is probably just gonna be kind of average or whatever. Which is basically the kind of opposite to what Finn McKenty is suggesting in that video. And really a lot of gimmicky bands like Ghost are often seen with a lot of skepticism by metalheads too. Or they're looked as if they're just pop music with like a dark image or something like that. It's not just me projecting. I mean, I can tell you there's definitely, I've seen several different comments. People say that in those words, you know, like Ghost is basically just a pop band, or that, or you know, people straight up saying, well, I initially didn't like big metal, or I initially didn't like Ghost, but you know, I just listened to the music a little bit more and I realized that they weren't all Image, and you know, there was something kind of interesting or different about them or something like that. And I think that the conclusion that you might draw from something like this depends a lot on what people you associate yourself with, you know, not the groups of people necessarily, but just the specific people that you might be, you know, you might have as friends, or that you might know. Maybe Finn does know like a few metalheads whose favorite bands are the gimmicky ones, and maybe he just kind of took that and ran with it and associated that to metalheads as a whole. But I think it seems to me that for the most part he's just kind of taking numbers from Spotify and assuming that those represent the metalhead community, when in reality I actually think metalheads tend to really favor that down-to-earth image, at least in terms of the band members themselves. I actually remember that video from J-Hope Films, which of course is sort of a parody, you know, it's very tongue-in-cheek, but there was a point where a guy was asked about a specific band or something like that, and he said something like, oh, I just saw that they had short hair and I started to be suspicious. And of course that is a joke and everything, but I think that to some degree that is true in terms of what metalheads might sometimes expect or think from certain band members when they don't quite have the look, the sort of really rugged and like careless look that metalheads or the traditional bands, I guess, are often expected to look like. And of course that also depends a lot on subjectivity, you know, we all know different people with different ideas and we have different experiences, and as far as I know there's no real statistics to say that this percent of metalheads have these gimmick bands as their favorites, and that's not really something that we can have much certainty about. I think another point that got a lot of people going about him is the video about trap metal, where he basically says that there's not much new and interesting stuff going on in extreme metal, and that metalheads pretty much have to learn to love or at least accept trap metal in their space if they want it to be relevant again, in commercial terms anyway. Which, okay, it's an interesting take, but at some point he says that extreme metal doesn't really allow for a lot of experimentation and melody, so there's not much else new to do, and that's obviously not true. In fact, one of his videos, I think it was the one about death metal, he says something about how melodic death is pointless because why would he want it to be melodic if it's death metal? So I mean, what is it really, you know? I don't understand. It's kind of contradictory. Something that I kind of somewhat agree with him is this idea that like metalheads either have to kind of admit that they're going to be a very niche genre and not complain about not being popular anymore or not being like a commercially viable music genre as a whole, I guess, or they have to learn to accept these less metal sounding genres. And you know, it's not like you can control what's going to be commercially successful or not, but at the same time I think that most metalheads know, musicians especially know, that like it's just not a genre that is going to have that is, you know, it's that commercially significant at the moment, you know. I think that most of us are pretty okay with the fact that it's more of an underground kind of thing, or at least the more extreme aspects of it are more underground. But he seems to assume that metalheads in general tend to want it to be more commercially relevant again, and that's not necessarily the case either. So another point that I want to touch on is the crowd killing video, which is the most recent video that I'm going to talk about. It's probably like a couple weeks old. Someone in the comments actually said in that video that he puts on the kid gloves when he talks about hardcore, and I think in this video at least it's kind of true. He really takes this approach when talking about crowd killing of saying, well, it's the name of the game, and he compares it to doing martial arts, which is just not equivalent at all, because being suddenly punched in the face is not a one-on-one fight that you just agreed on just by going to the show. And he says, well, you should expect people to just like become violent at any moment, but he also says that people in hardcore aren't really that violent either, but also you should expect them to be violent. I mean, and then he says that a lot of these really violent people are trauma survivors, and it's like, okay, that's probably true, but what about the other people around them who might be hurt by them and they do nothing to them? Are they not also potentially trauma survivors themselves? I mean, it doesn't really make any difference, because it could be either the perpetrator of the victim or the victim who are trauma survivors, you know. It doesn't really work in either case to justify, or it might explain it, but it doesn't really make much of a difference for an argument. And he also keeps implying that crowd killing happens because people talk shit and get hit. And yeah, obviously if you're picking fights with someone, you would expect that person to maybe become violent as a reaction, but I think it's very evident that when people talk about crowd killing, they're talking about something different. They're talking about people who are not in the pit, they're not doing anything to you, they're just kind of, they just happen to be around you, you know, people like that getting hurt. And it seems like he's trying to pretend that the situations that crowd killing, the term refers to, are different than what the question was talking about, or what the term really tends to refer to oftentimes. And then in the end he says something like, well, it's not even worth discussing because, you know, it is what it is, it's called hardcore, so it's gonna be really hard and stuff. And how is it not worth discussing? You know, I think anything that revolves around violence is definitely worth discussing. It's not like the hardcore scene just developed, you know, by nature, independently from people's thoughts and beliefs, and crowd killing is just some sort of like natural disaster that, you know, just some act of God that we can do anything about. Like, it's not even worth it to discuss it because, you know, it's just something that happens in nature. Like, it isn't like that. And I think the reason why that bothers me as well, and I'm assuming, of course, I'm assuming stuff here, but since he's a little bit biased against the metal, it almost seems like, you know, I was watching that video and felt he would never cut metalheads this much slack. He would not, you know. It's just hardcore that he's like, okay, I'm just gonna have to try really hard to defend this because, you know, it's what I like. So I just don't think that video makes a lot of good points, honestly. So a couple of things that I have liked and that I have learned from these videos is that making money as a musician isn't something bad, which probably sounds a little bit ridiculous. Like, of course it's not bad. Why would making money be bad? But I feel like there's always this sort of contradiction between the musician and the listener in terms of that, you know, there's some niche genre or some alternative genre where the listener often associates the realness with a sort of lack of commercial success, of staying in the underground and not being too accessible. And of course a musician would want to do something interesting and different, but they also would like to, I imagine, would like to be able to live off of making music as opposed to having to resort to other jobs just to make ends meet. And sometimes listeners just don't really think about that much. Another thing is questioning bad taste, which is something that I spoke about in my more recent Guilty Pleasures video. Sometimes you might be wired to dislike something or that admit it's bad, somehow like objectively bad, because it's associated with things that are like lowbrow or tacky or low class or whatever. But there's really nothing that you can really point to as like, oh, that makes it bad, except for maybe like being too on the nose or something kind of vague like that. And there are often qualities in music that make it more appealing. And like I said in that previous video, it's not necessarily easy to make a catchy, accessible song that is also not annoying and that it's memorable and that it will become a hit. You know, it's not just anyone who can make a song like that. So yeah, I'm glad that I found his channel after all, even though I do disagree with him on a lot of things, but of course it just makes for more discussion. But again, I think that I also just learned a lot of things from watching his channel. So tell me what you guys think down below, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.